Jax's revenge domain. The OSHA investigator was photographing our missing lockout tags when I realized that Bryce Patterson had just handed me his resignation letter. He just didn't know it yet. I'm Richard Coleman, 48 years old, and I've been running operations at Peterson Manufacturing for 15 years. Built our safety program from the ground up, turned us from a workers' comp nightmare into an industry standard. But standing there watching that federal inspector document violation after violation, all I could think was how perfectly this moment proved that sometimes the best revenge is just letting incompetent people hang themselves with their own efficiency rope. Let me back up to where this all started, because the beautiful thing about workplace justice is that it usually begins with something small and stupid that reveals everything you need to know about a person's character. 4 months ago, Stephen Walsh, our CEO, brought in Bryce Patterson as an efficiency consultant, 29 years old, fresh MBA, and the kind of confidence that comes from never actually building anything with your hands. Bryce had worked for some consulting firm in Chicago, helping companies streamline operations and maximize shareholder value. Translation, he fired people and called it optimization. The first red flag came during Bryce's introductory meeting with department heads. He stood at the head of our conference table, the same table where we'd celebrated 15 years of safety improvements, and announced that he'd identified significant redundancies in our operational framework. When I asked what specific redundancies, he said, "We'll address those in our individual strategic alignment sessions." Corporate speak for "I'll tell you later in private," where you can't ask uncomfortable questions. The second red flag was his obsession with our safety protocols. Bryce kept referring to them as legacy procedures that needed modernization. When I explained that our safety standards were tied to our $2.8 million government contract, he nodded like he understood, but then asked if we could phase out some of the more antiquated requirements. That's when I knew we had a problem. OSHA regulations aren't suggestions you can phase out because they clash with your efficiency metrics. The warning signs escalated over the next 2 months. My calendar invites started disappearing. First from operations meetings, then safety reviews, then even the monthly insurance walkthroughs I'd been running for a decade. When I confronted Stephen about it, he gave me that uncomfortable smile executives use when they're about to deliver bad news wrapped in corporate therapy speak. "Rich," he said, "Bryce thinks you'd be more valuable focusing on strategic planning while the operational team handles day-to-day execution." Strategic planning. That's what they tell the old dog when they're bringing in a new pack. But I'd been around long enough to know that strategic planning is where good employees go to die slowly and quietly. Then came the meeting reshuffles. My one-on-ones with department heads became group efficiency sessions led by Bryce. My safety reports started getting filtered through Nicole Turner, a junior coordinator who meant well but couldn't tell the difference between OSHA compliance and company suggestion. Meanwhile, Bryce brought in his own people, consultants who called themselves operational excellence specialists, and had to ask me what a near-miss report was during their first week. But here's the thing about being a former Army logistics officer. You learn to document everything and think 3 steps ahead. While Bryce was busy playing corporate chess, I was quietly building a paper trail that would make a prosecutor weep with joy. Every email got saved, every Slack conversation got screenshotted, every decision that bypassed safety protocols got filed in a folder I labeled documentation. Because in the military, you learn that wars are won with paperwork as much as firepower. The breaking point came 6 weeks ago with an email that landed in my inbox at 7:47 a.m. Subject line, Operational Communication Protocol Update. I knew Bryce was about to drop another corporate bomb before I even opened it. The email was one line. All safety-related communications will now be routed through HR effective immediately. No explanation, no meeting, just Bryce doing what MBA consultants do best, fixing things that weren't broken. I stared at that email for maybe 30 seconds, feeling that familiar calm that comes right before everything goes sideways. This wasn't just another power play. This was the final move to push me out of my own department. But it was also the moment Bryce made his fatal mistake, because while he was busy silencing me, he forgot to actually remove my authority. See, there's a difference between being cut out of meetings and having your legal designations revoked. Bryce had assumed that marginalizing me was the same as neutralizing me, but my signature was still on file as the authorized safety officer. My access badges still worked. My OSHA certifications were still current. He'd gagged me without bothering to defang me, and that oversight was about to cost him everything. The first safety violation I documented was almost accidental. Walking through the shop floor after Bryce's communication lockdown, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. They'd removed the secondary exit signs from the welding bay. When I asked Patricia Johnson, our longtime secretary, about it, she said Bryce had approved the removal because the signs cluttered the visual workspace and impacted productivity metrics. That's when I realized this wasn't about efficiency anymore. This was about a 29-year-old consultant who thought safety protocols were negotiable suggestions that got in the way of his quarterly performance bonus. But OSHA doesn't negotiate, and federal compliance isn't subject to efficiency reviews. Bryce had just crossed a line he didn't even know existed, and I was the only person in the building qualified to draw it back in blood. Over the next 3 weeks, I became a ghost in my own building. Not the kind of ghost that rattles chains and moans about unfinished business. More like the kind that quietly documents every safety violation while management assumes you've been neutralized. Bryce had made me invisible, but he'd forgotten that invisible people see everything. The second violation I found was in the chemical storage area. Bryce had optimized the layout to increase storage capacity, which sounded great in a PowerPoint presentation, but meant inadequate ventilation for the solvents we used in parts cleaning. The ventilation system I'd insisted on installing 3 years ago had been partially disconnected because it interfered with the new shelving configuration. When I asked Alan Rodriguez, our shop supervisor, about it, he just shook his head. Bryce said the old system was overkill, told us modern chemicals don't need as much ventilation. Alan had been running that department for 12 years and knew more about chemical safety than Bryce would learn in a lifetime, but he also had a family to feed and couldn't afford to argue with the efficiency expert. That's when I realized what Bryce was really doing. He wasn't just cutting costs or streamlining processes. He was systematically dismantling 15 years of safety improvements because they didn't show up on his quarterly efficiency metrics. Every protocol I'd fought for, every upgrade I'd justified to insurance companies, every procedure that had kept our workers going home intact, all of it was being sacrificed to make his numbers look good. The third violation was the most dangerous. Bryce had eliminated the mandatory lockout/tagout procedures on our new CNC equipment because the machines had built-in safety features that made the old protocols redundant. He'd convinced Stephen that we were wasting time with outdated procedures when modern technology provided better protection. I photographed the missing lockout tags and interviewed the operators who'd been told to skip the procedures. Every conversation was the same. They knew it was wrong, but Bryce had made it clear that anyone who couldn't adapt to modern efficiency standards might not be a good fit for the company's future direction. You know what really got me? These weren't just safety violations, they were betrayals. I'd spent 15 years building relationships with these workers, earning their trust, showing them that management actually cared about their well-being. Now Bryce was forcing them to choose between their safety and their jobs. That's not efficiency, that's extortion. By the end of the month, I'd documented 8 separate violations, each one tied directly to Bryce's efficiency improvements. Missing safety equipment, inadequate ventilation, eliminated procedures, delayed training updates. It was like he'd used our safety manual as a checklist for what to cut first. But the violation that sealed his fate came during a routine walkthrough. I was checking our compliance with the latest OSHA updates when I overheard Bryce talking to a group of new hires. He was giving them the company orientation, which used to be my job before I got strategically realigned. Now, about safety equipment, Bryce was saying, company policy requires hard hats in designated areas, but let's be realistic. Modern equipment and proper training are better protection than outdated gear that slows down productivity. Use your judgment. I stopped walking. Use your judgment. He was telling new employees, people who'd been on the job for less than a week, to use their judgment about federal safety requirements. OSHA Regulation 29 CFR 1926.95 doesn't have a use your judgment clause. Hard hat requirements in construction and manufacturing aren't suggestions subject to productivity analysis. That's when I knew I had him. Not just for incompetence or poor management, but for willful disregard of federal safety regulations. Because once you start telling employees to ignore OSHA requirements, you've crossed from efficiency optimization into criminal negligence territory. I spent the next week building my case like a federal prosecutor preparing for trial. Every violation was photographed with timestamps. Every witness statement was documented and cross-referenced. Every regulation was cited with specific code numbers and compliance requirements. I pulled maintenance records, training logs, incident reports, and equipment certifications. The file I compiled was 47 pages of pure regulatory ammunition. 12 documented violations, each one tied to specific decisions Bryce had made without consulting the designated safety officer. Each violation backed up with photographic evidence, witness statements, and regulatory citations that could withstand federal scrutiny. But I didn't stop with documentation. I researched the financial implications. Our $2.8 million government contract required maintaining an 88% safety compliance rating. Dropped below that threshold for 2 consecutive quarters, and the Defense Contract Management Agency could suspend the agreement pending investigation. With 12 violations already documented and more emerging weekly, we were on track to fall below 85% by next quarter. The insurance implications were even worse. Our workers' comp premiums were locked in at current rates based on our historical safety record. A pattern of violations could trigger policy review and potentially double our premiums. For a company our size, that meant an additional $180,000 annually in insurance costs. I also discovered something beautiful buried in our archived files from 2019, the OSHA Voluntary Partnership Agreement I'd negotiated when we upgraded our safety standards. The document was clear about enforcement authority. Safety compliance violations identified by designated safety officers require immediate remediation and federal notification within 72 hours of documentation. That designated safety officer? Still me. My signature was on every page of that agreement. Bryce had never bothered to file the paperwork to remove my authority because he'd assumed that cutting me out of meetings was sufficient. But legal authority and meeting invitations are two very different things, and that oversight was about to destroy him. The report I prepared wasn't angry or emotional. Military training teaches you that the most devastating weapons are the quiet ones. This was 12 pages of pure regulatory compliance, citing specific violations and required remediation timelines. Professional, thorough, and absolutely lethal to anyone who thought safety regulations were optional. I sent the report on a Tuesday morning at 8:47 a.m. Not to Bryce, not to Stephen, not to our legal department or HR. Straight to the OSHA district office with copies to our insurance carrier and the Defense Contract Management Agency. Because when you're dealing with federal safety regulations and a $2.8 million government contract, you don't waste time with internal politics. The subject line was simple: Mandatory Safety Violation Report, Patterson Manufacturing. Immediate federal review required. The body was even simpler. Pursuant to OSHA regulations 29 CFR 1926, and Patterson Manufacturing's Voluntary Partnership Agreement. Attached documentation outlines 12 safety compliance violations requiring immediate federal notification. Remediation timeline and regulatory response requested within 72 hours per Section 4.3 of existing partnership agreement. I attached the 47-page violation report, hit send, and then did something I hadn't done in months. I made myself a cup of coffee, sat back in my chair, and smiled. Not because I was happy about the violations, not because I enjoyed seeing safety standards compromised, but because I knew that in exactly 72 hours, Bryce Patterson was going to learn the difference between efficiency, optimization, and federal regulatory compliance. The response was faster than I expected. By Thursday morning, OSHA had assigned an investigator. By Thursday afternoon, they'd scheduled an on-site inspection for the following Monday. By Friday, our insurance company was calling with routine questions about our risk management procedures. And by Monday morning, the Defense Contract Management Agency had flagged our account for compliance review pending investigation. I watched it all unfold from my quiet corner office like a general observing artillery strikes on enemy positions. Every phone call that came into Stephen's office, every emergency meeting that got called without including me, every panicked conversation between Bryce and whoever he thought could save him. The beautiful thing about federal investigations is that they're binary. Either you're compliant or you're not. There's no corporate spin that makes missing lockout, tagout procedures acceptable, no MBA theory that justifies inadequate chemical storage ventilation. When OSHA investigators show up with clipboards and cameras, all the consultants speak in the world won't protect you from basic regulatory reality. Monday morning at 9:15 a.m., 2 OSHA investigators walked through our front door. I watched from my office window as they introduced themselves to Patricia Johnson at reception. Patricia looked confused, She hadn't been told they were coming because Bryce was still trying to figure out how to control the narrative. The lead investigator was a woman in her 50s who'd probably seen every safety shortcut and corporate excuse in the book. Her partner was younger but carried himself like someone who knew exactly what he was looking for. They asked for the designated safety officer, and Patricia pointed them toward my office. "Mr. Coleman," the lead investigator said as they knocked on my door. "I'm Inspector Sarah Davis, OSHA District 6. We're here regarding the safety violation report you filed last Tuesday." I stood up, shook their hands, and said the words I'd been waiting weeks to say. "Thank you for coming. I have all documentation ready for your review, and I can provide a guided tour of each violation site." For the next 4 hours, I walked those investigators through every safety failure Bryce had created. The missing lockout tags, the inadequate ventilation, the eliminated procedures, the missing safety equipment. Each violation was photographed, measured, and documented with the kind of methodical precision that makes federal investigators happy and corporate executives sweat. The best moment came when we reached the area where Bryce had told new hires to use their judgment about hard hats. Inspector Davis asked me to explain the company policy, so I pulled out the employee handbook and read the exact language. Hard hats are mandatory in all designated areas as required by OSHA Regulation 29 CFR 1926.95. "And who authorized the modification of this policy?" she asked. "No one with authority to modify safety policies," I replied. "The changes were implemented without consultation with the designated safety officer." She made a note in her file. "Who is the designated safety officer?" "I am." Another note. "And you weren't consulted on these changes?" "I was specifically excluded from safety-related communications and decision-making processes." The look that passed between those two investigators told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't just about safety violations anymore. This was about willful disregard for federal regulations by management personnel who thought efficiency metrics trumped workplace safety. By Tuesday afternoon, word of the OSHA investigation had reached Stephen's office. I know because Linda Coleman from HR appeared at my door looking like someone who'd just realized her company was about to be featured in a federal enforcement action. "Rich," she said, "Stephen needs to see you in the conference room." Immediately, I stood up, straightened my shirt, and walked the same hallways I'd walked for 15 years, past the safety awards we'd won when people still cared about worker protection, past the 0 days without incident board that Bryce had wanted to remove because it promoted negative safety messaging. The conference room was packed, Stephen Walsh at the head of the table looking like a man who'd just discovered his ship was taking on water. Jason Murphy, our general counsel, had papers spread everywhere like he was trying to build a legal firewall out of documentation. Alan Rodriguez from the shop floor was there, along with Nicole Turner and 2 people I didn't recognize but figured were either from our insurance company or outside legal counsel. Stephen looked directly at me. "Rich, we need to understand how this OSHA situation developed." I didn't hesitate. I filed a mandatory safety violation report as required by federal regulations and our partnership agreement. "It's my legal responsibility as designated safety officer." Jason Murphy cleared his throat. "The violations cited in your report, OSHA confirmed them?" "All 12, I said. "Photographic evidence, regulatory citations, timeline documentation. Everything's been verified." That's when the door opened and Bryce walked in. The temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees. He looked around like a man trying to figure out which direction the firing squad was facing. Stephen turned to Bryce like a judge about to deliver a verdict. "These safety changes you implemented, were they reviewed by our designated safety officer?" Bryce's jaw worked like he was chewing something bitter. "We were optimizing processes, eliminating redundant procedures that hindered productivity metrics." "That's not what I asked," Stephen said, and his voice had that edge you only hear when a CEO realizes his company is about to be destroyed by someone's stupidity. "Were they reviewed by our safety officer? Yes or no?" The silence stretched out like a guitar string about to snap, because Bryce couldn't say yes without lying to a room full of lawyers during a federal investigation, and he couldn't say no without admitting he'd ignored federal safety requirements for 4 months. Jason Murphy, our general counsel, stepped in with the kind of question that ends careers. "Mr. Patterson, were you aware that safety protocol changes require approval from designated safety officers under OSHA regulations?" "I was implementing efficiency improvements," Bryce said. Modern management theory emphasizes eliminating bottlenecks in operational workflows. That's not an answer, Jason replied. Were you aware of the regulatory requirements or not? Another silence. Then Bryce made the mistake that buried him completely. Those regulations were written for outdated manufacturing processes. Modern equipment and training protocols provide superior safety outcomes without bureaucratic oversight. Every person in that room, and I mean every single person, just stared at him, because what Bryce had just said in front of witnesses during a federal investigation was that he'd knowingly ignored OSHA regulations because he thought he was smarter than federal safety law. Jason Murphy closed his laptop so hard I thought he'd crack the screen. Stephen Walsh looked like a man watching his company's insurance policy spontaneously combust. And the two people I didn't recognize were frantically taking notes like court reporters at a murder trial. Stephen finally found his voice. Mr. Patterson, you're telling us you deliberately bypassed federal safety regulations? I optimized processes based on current best practices and efficiency metrics, Bryce replied, apparently unaware he was digging his grave one MBA buzzword at a time. That's when Inspector Davis walked into the conference room. Nobody had called her. Nobody had invited her. She just appeared like the ghost of federal regulations past, carrying a folder thick enough to choke a consultant. "Excuse me," she said. "I'm Inspector Sarah. Davis, OSHA District 6. I need to speak with whoever authorized the safety modifications we documented yesterday." Every eye in the room turned toward Bryce like spotlights finding a burglar. Stephen pointed at him with the enthusiasm of a man throwing someone else overboard. "That would be Mr. Patterson, our efficiency consultant." Inspector Davis looked at Bryce with the kind of professional calm that makes smart people very nervous. "Mr. Patterson, can you explain why mandatory lockout-tagout procedures were eliminated without safety officer approval?" Bryce tried to rally. Modern CNC equipment has built-in safety features that make traditional procedures redundant. We were eliminating inefficiencies in the operational workflow. "I see," Inspector Davis said, making a note. "And who authorized you to determine that federal safety requirements were redundant?" "It was a management decision based on efficiency analysis and modern safety theory." "So you're saying you personally decided that OSHA regulations didn't apply to your operational improvements?" That's when Bryce finally realized he was standing in a minefield. His face went pale as he understood that every word out of his mouth was being documented by a federal investigator who could shut down our entire operation with a phone call. "I implemented best practices based on current management theory and operational excellence principles," he stammered. Inspector Davis nodded like a doctor confirming a terminal diagnosis. "Mr. Walsh," she said, turning to Stephen, "we'll need all documentation related to these operational changes, along with records showing who authorized modifications to federally mandated safety procedures." Stephen looked at Jason Murphy. Jason looked at his legal files. Both of them looked at Bryce like he'd just confessed to arson. "Inspector Davis," Stephen said carefully, "if these changes weren't properly authorized, then you have 72 hours to restore all federally mandated safety procedures and submit a compliance restoration plan. Failure to comply will result in immediate work stoppage orders and escalated enforcement action." The room went dead quiet. Work stoppage orders meant shutting down production. Escalated enforcement meant congressional investigations and federal penalties that could bankrupt a company our size. Inspector Davis left behind a folder of violation notices and remediation requirements. After she walked out, Stephen turned to Bryce with the look of a man who'd just watched his retirement fund evaporate. "You're terminated," he said. "Effective immediately. Security will escort you out." Bryce tried to object, but Jason Murphy cut him off. "Mr. Patterson, I strongly advise you to leave quietly and consult with legal counsel regarding your potential liability for regulatory violations." They walked Bryce out like he was carrying state secrets. No goodbye speech, no handshake, just a quiet exit that spoke louder than any dramatic confrontation. Stephen turned to me after earned. Bryce was gone. "Rich, I need someone I trust to restore our safety compliance and manage this situation with OSHA." He paused, then said the words I'd been waiting 4 months to hear. "I'm promoting you to Chief Operations Officer, effective immediately. Your first job is fixing everything that consultant broke." That afternoon, I walked through the plant with a different title and the same mission I'd always had: keeping people safe. The lockout tags went back up. The ventilation system got reconnected. The hard hat policy was reinstated without any use your judgment clauses. But the real satisfaction wasn't in the title or the vindication. It was in watching our people go back to work, knowing their safety mattered more than some consultants' efficiency metrics. Patricia Johnson stopped by my office that evening. "You know," she said, "that boy never did understand that this place was built by people who knew the difference between working smart and working stupid." I sat in my office that night, looking at the same safety certificates I'd earned over 15 years, thinking about what I'd learned. Sometimes the best way to fight corporate arrogance isn't with confrontation or politics. Sometimes you just have to let incompetent people prove they're incompetent while you document every mistake they make. Bryce tried to silence me, but in doing so, he forgot that real authority doesn't come from meeting invitations or org charts. It comes from knowing the rules better than the people trying to break them. The most dangerous person in any company isn't the loudest voice in the room. It's the quiet one who actually reads the fine print.